Okay. Front squatting is another one of our main staple movements, but it's also one that people mess up a ton. So first we're going to just go over the hand position on the bar. So we're going to want the bar right around sternum height or a little bit higher, maybe towards your clavicles. You get too low, then you have to really crouch under the bar to get set up. Too high, obviously you have to get on your tiptoes to get to it. As a general rule, when we're talking about a front rack grip, there's a couple of different ways, but you're going to first want to just stand at your side, point your palms facing forward, curl up, and now lift your elbows up. So your front rack position will be somewhere around here. If you get way too close, your elbows start to come out. Way too far, and then you really start to crank on your elbows in that position. So that's a good way just to find where your front rack position would be. So he's going to go first through a regular front rack position, then we're going to show you a crossover grip, and how to do it with straps if you don't have that wrist flexibility. Because again, you do need a certain amount of tricep and wrist flexibility to get into that position. And notice how he doesn't have to crank on anything or force that position. It's a comfortable high elbow position. A lot of guys that have more rounded thoracic spines are going to have a hard time getting to that position because they're so rounded over, they're really going to have to crank their shoulders up to get into that position. So a lot of times, the inability to get into that front rack position actually comes from overly rounded thoracic spines, and that's where we're going to need to place some of that corrective emphasis towards getting you more in that upright position. So if you don't have the mobility to get into that true front rack position, we're going to show you how to do it with a crossover grip and then how to do it with straps. So crossover grip, notice how he's first making sure he's centering his throat right on the center of the bar. We have this bar taped just so that you don't have to worry about finding the center each time. Okay? From there, it's just a relaxed position. Again, the bar is in the groove right behind his deltoids, so it's a comfortable position. If he wanted to, he could actually take his hands off the bar and just balance it straight out in front of him. So he's not actively using his hands to hold the bar up. The bar is balancing right behind that shelf, behind his anterior deltoids. Okay? That's actually the grip that we recommend for most of you guys, unless you've been squatting with a front rack grip your entire life or for many years, and you're very comfortable with it. But we're just going to show you, for the sake of this video, the third way to do a front rack grip, and it's just to use lifting straps. Again, it takes out some of the mobility limitations with your tricep and your wrist by not having to get nearly as far down to get to the bar. So again, we're not actively contracting the triceps here, it's just loosely holding the bar in place and using that for a little bit of balance and stability. Next thing we're going to talk about is footwear and foot position. Okay, the stance that you're going to have to take in your squatting movements is going to vary greatly depending on your individual anatomy. So depending on your hip structure, you might need to take a little bit wider of a stance or a little bit more narrow of a stance. But generally, we're going to be starting with about a shoulder width or slightly wider than shoulder width stance, and the toes turned slightly out. Okay, if that doesn't work for you, we're going to show you how to kind of adjust it more narrow or a little bit wider, and also adjusting that toe position. But for most people, somewhere in this range, about 30 degrees of your toes turned out, and a little bit wider than shoulder width is going to be just about right. Okay. As we descend into the squat, we're going to want to make sure that we keep the weight firmly planted on the heels the entire time. If your weight comes up onto your toes at the bottom of the movement, that's generally an ankle mobility issue. One thing that we recommend for guys who have ankle issues is to actually elevate the heels on 5-pound plates or wear Olympic lifting shoes. And what that does is it raises your heel and it reduces the requirement for ankle flexibility at the bottom of that movement. So while we can make sure we're safely squatting, while separate in the program, we address the ankle mobility issues so that we can ultimately not need the Olympic lifting shoes or not need to use that as a crutch. But we're going to show you what that looks like. He does have good enough mobility that he can squat without Olympic lifting shoes, without plates under his heels. So we'll show you what that looks like, and then we'll show you what it would look like with the 5-pound plate crutch if you can't get your squat to look like this right away. Go ahead. So you'll notice his knees are tracking out directly in line with his toes. So his toes are pointed out about 30-degree angle. His knees are tracking along that roughly 30-degree angle the entire time. Okay, he's going a little deeper than all of you might necessarily need to go, but you definitely want to make sure you're getting at least parallel at the bottom of that squat. Okay. With the weight plates, again, just put them under the heels. And that might be a little bit uncomfortable at first. Obviously, Olympic lifting shoes are going to be more comfortable, but a more expensive option. Good. Squat down, and you'll notice how much more upright he's able to stay throughout the entire movement. The next important piece of being able to squat a decent amount of weight safely is being able to focus on the breathing. So a lot of guys don't even worry about breathing. They've never been taught how to breathe when they squat, and they go through their movements, and at the bottom of their squat, their lumbar spine starts to go into flexion, their pelvis rounds under, they get what's called butt wink. This can be this is not necessarily the safest position for your lumbar spine to go into heavy loaded flexion at the bottom of that movement. So one way to effectively brace your abdominals is to focus on breathing. So at the start of each rep, what we're going to do is we're going to actively breathe in through our belly, fill our belly and everything around our diaphragm with air by actively inhaling and pressing out against our abdominals. So what this is going to do is basically create a natural weight belt for you by increasing the intra-abdominal pressure. And so this is going to be able to help you maintain that flat lumbar spine all the way through the entire movement, even at the bottom of the squat. So go ahead and turn around so you can see your belly breathing out. So start of the movement, he's going to take that breath in, pressing out against my hand, and he's going to hold that through the bottom of the rep. So he's holding that breath right now, pushing out, pushing out, pushing out on his belly. Now he exhales. Now before the next rep starts, same thing, pushing out against my hand, holding it, release it. So every single rep we're going to go ahead and reset with that breath. This is most important as you start getting into your heavier sets, but be especially cognizant of your breathing, even on your warm-up sets, just to be reinforcing good patterns so that when you do get under heavier loads, that's kind of a second nature habit. Main difference between back squats and front squats is the bar position. What the bar position is going to do is shift the emphasis of where we're working our legs during the rep. So as the bar position is more anteriorly loaded, so on a front squat, and we're more upright at the bottom of the movement, that shifts the emphasis towards the quads. As we go towards a back squat position with a posteriorly loaded weight, that shifts the emphasis towards the glutes and the hamstrings, because at the bottom of the movement we're going to be more in a bent over position. So front squat more quad dominant, back squat more glute and hamstring dominant. Okay, we're going to start and show you hand position here. We don't want to get too narrow with our hand position, because then what happens is you have to really crank on your shoulders to get into that bar position. That's creating a lot more stress on your anterior shoulder, a lot more valgus stress into external rotation. If you feel any sort of valgus stress or any sort of yanking on your elbow, then that hand position that you've chosen is not going to be the best hand position for you. So just be aware of that. You shouldn't feel any sort of cranking on your elbows. Okay, that being said, most guys are going to want a slightly wider grip to start. So he's about as wide as he can get on the squat rack here. Okay. Again, we have the barbell marked, we have the center of the bar marked, so that as you're coming under the bar, you can make sure that it's centered on the back of your neck. Bar position. I don't know if you can see, but the bar is directly on the meat of his traps. Okay, he's not on the bone in his neck. It's not too high up on his neck, and it's not too low in a low bar position where it starts to crank on his shoulders. So this is called a high bar position, where it's right in the meat of his traps. As far as back squat foot position, it's very similar to front squat foot position. Again, it's going to depend on individual anatomy, but starting with that shoulder, slightly wider than shoulder width and toes slightly out position is going to be about right for most people. As far as the breathing is identical to the front squat in terms of at the start of each rep, we're breathing into our belly, not into our upper chest. We're trying to create a ton of intra-abdominal pressure through our belly. So big breath, and now as we descend into the rep, it's much more of a hips back movement than a front squat. So we're not necessarily trying to stay perfectly upright as we would in a front squat. He's allowing the hips to track back, pushing his hips back, keeping the weight on the heels the entire time, and driving up. Okay. Other thing to be aware of, as he gets to the top of the rep, he's actively squeezing his glutes to finish the movement. So he's getting a strong hip extension, glute contraction at the top. He's not just finishing with his quads like that. He's going through knee extension and hip extension simultaneously as he comes up through the top of the movement. A common mistake a lot of people make is hyperextending their neck through the movement, and this is often derived from coaches who want the athlete to keep the chest up, and so their cue to keep the chest up is to keep the eyes up. What happens though is we start to create a ton of hyperextension in the cervical spine, which detracts from our ability to keep a stable, neutral spinal position. So instead, keep that gaze right about eye level on the wall, and then as you go through the movement, your gaze is going to match whatever your torso angle is. So at the bottom of the movement, when you're a little bit more bent over, the eyes are going to be a little bit lower on the wall. At the top of the movement, they're going to be a little bit higher on the wall. But again, that cervical spine stays neutral in line with the rest of the torso throughout the entire movement, not cranking the neck into cervical hyperextension just to try to keep the chest up. Again, the chest should stay up based on what the rest of the body is doing, not as a result of cranking the neck into a less stable position. If you still can't hit consistent depth on your back squat or your front squats, then the box squat is another alternative that we use. The key thing that people mess up on the box squat is that everything stays the same as a regular squat up until this point, but they'll get to the box and they'll take that tension that they've created in their abdominals and they'll totally lose that tension, relax when they get on the box, and then try to suddenly get that tension back when they come up. Okay, biggest thing is we need to be stable and maintain that tension as we get to the box. Nothing changes and we don't relax when we hit the box. So a lot of coaches will teach to rock back on the box, relax, and then drive up out of it. We're using the box more as a gauge of depth. So we're just tapping the box. It's a touch and go box squat where we're just using it to make sure that we're getting constant depth. If you still can't get proper depth with a box squat, then again, elevating the heels just like you would on a front squat. And if you still can't get depth even with that, you're probably not ready to be squatting.
Call the doctor.
Again, within this range, it's usually good to experiment with foot position a little bit. We've seen guys who, a narrow foot position, they get completely locked right here, but as soon as we elevate their heels, widen their toes just a little bit, and they're able to get fully parallel on their squat. You may never get a true Olympic lifter, astrograph squat depth, and that's okay. Not everyone has the hip anatomy to do that. No matter how much stretching you do, you might not necessarily be able to get that type of depth. That's fine. But everyone, for the most part, can and should be able to get to a true parallel squat. So if you try all this and you still can't get consistent depth, you're probably not ready to do any sort of squatting yet.